childbirth, child rearing was very important and needed to invoke the presence of superhuman beings, gods like Bes, who's a little dwarf with feathers in his hair, who holds knives to scare off the demons that are lurking at the edge of our world, or Taweret, who's shown as a pregnant hippopotamus who would come and scare off dangerous beings.
From the secrets of the pyramids to the mysteries of mummification, ancient Egypt has captivated the popular imagination for centuries. In this History Extra podcast series, we're looking back at this remarkable culture which has left such a significant mark on history. I'm your host, Emily Briffett, and I'm joined by Dr. Campbell Price, Curator of Egypt and Sudan at Manchester Museum. In this second episode, we're turning our attention to the day-to-day experiences of ordinary ancient Egyptians, painting a vivid picture of life along the Nile. Hi, Campbell. Welcome back. Thank you for joining us again.
Hello again. No, it's a pleasure to be back.
So, as I've said, we're going to be talking about the average, ordinary ancient Egyptian. Now, we need to start. Who is that?
Well, in terms of numbers, Emily, I think that person would be a farmer or someone in a farmer's family, because Egypt is still largely, and certainly then, an agricultural economy. So there's lots of farmland, very rich, very fertile land on which to do your farming. And I think so much of ancient Egypt is geared in the popular mind towards rich people. And they were not out in the fields farming. But at a guess, maybe, 80, 90% of people would work on the land.
Now, we also need to probably set our boundaries of what we know about the lives of the ordinary ancient Egyptian. How close can we get to them as a person?
Less close, probably, than we would like. The part of the reason for the focus on the rich and the dead is because it's rich people's tombs that have survived. So, Egypt is a land of contrasts. You have the river Nile, which is this life-giving artery that brings life to that part of northeastern Africa. And next to the river, you have the farmland. And on the farmland, you have would have had most people's houses, made of mud bricks, which, when there was an annual flood, which happened before the 1960s with the building of the Aswan High Dam, it no longer happens. Before that time, and I've spoken to Egyptian friends whose grandparents remember, the river would burst its banks and it would flood up to the village, and sometimes houses would need repair or total reconstruction. So if we're thinking about archaeological evidence, if people's houses are being damaged in that way, there is almost no evidence for most settlements. So the prime bit of evidence we would want for an ordinary person's life is gone. So we have to extrapolate from other sources, incidental appearances of non-elite people in elite sources, and that can be quite tricky.
And we're going to talk about their homes and livelihoods in a little bit. Mm-hmm. But first, what unites the people of 3000 BC with those of 300 BC? It's such a huge time period.
It's a long time period, and that's a really interesting way to frame it. Yeah, what unites those people with that huge gulf of time? I think there would be some concepts that would be familiar. The river and the notion of Egypt itself as a unitary big concept, I think, would be apparent to those people. But having said that, two important points. Things change with time. All ancient Egyptians are not the same. You cannot lump everyone in over such a long period of time. In the same way as things have changed, in the last 30 years. Imagine in the UK how much things have changed in 3,000 years in Egypt. So there was a lot of change. New technologies, new ways of forming pots, new ways of expressing ideas about the divine. And Egypt was very regional. So an experience of someone on the Mediterranean coast would be quite different from someone in the very south of Egypt.
Where did people actually live? What did their homes look like?
So people lived pretty close to the floodplain, as I said, because that's where their livelihoods were. Tombs, in contrast, were in the desert, which is not terribly far away, but suitably far that you could keep the dead separate, but not so far that you couldn't visit your ancestors. That's important. There are archaeological features that we know as tells, so mounds. And they're ideal because people build their houses one on top of each other, and you can excavate down and get an impression of the outline of earlier structures. But people use objects, and objects only get preserved really if they're put in tombs or they're broken and appear in settlements. I think the typical ancient Egyptian house would have its mud brick walls. There would be rooms within it used by the people. I suspect most people slept on the roof because it's hot and the roof is cooler. And we have some model houses. So this is a good source of evidence. We have model houses made of pottery from around 1800 BCE, where there are features of tombs, but also features of houses, and there are lovely little air vents are shown. So if you make a structure of mud brick, you can have a kind of like a hood to catch the prevailing northern breeze. So in Egypt, the breeze comes down from the north.
I think that really brings us close to the lived experience of what it would be like in the ancient Egyptian home, which is fascinating considering how distant we are in time.
Yes.
Now, what did populated centres look like? Did they have towns? Was it villages? Were there cities?
Oh, much debate concerns the existence of cities. And it has been said ancient Egypt was a culture without cities. That's probably not true. We have got some literary evidence, again, from the literary elite, these small group that don't want to be doing muddy, dirty jobs, but want to sit in their cushy villas and write documents. These people compose hymns of praise to cities. They talk about the beautiful towers of temples and the gardens. They talk a lot about, elite gardens. I think the normal experience would have been of a local town, like an urban centre. But how they were arranged, we don't have very much evidence because the river has moved and destroyed the settlement. It's all very frustrating. But something that maybe we make too much of, in my own opinion, is the existence of roads. Because if you don't have wheeled vehicles, you don't really need roads. You have donkeys to move around, but the major thoroughfare is the river. So you need access to the river to go any distance. And something interesting to me is there is not, like we have in maybe Greece and Rome, the kind of the agora or some kind of public space to hang out like a town square with statues and things. The public statuary wasn't a big thing. Statues were in restricted places like tombs, elite tombs, or within temple courtyards where most people couldn't go in. So actual exchange of news, views, like where would you hang out with people, might be on the riverbank at market. And we know both men and women were marketeering. In fact, there's more evidence for women doing sales transactions than men in markets, as an interesting aside. So normal practice, normal behaviour, normal experience of the world would be in the home, I guess, but if you were gathering together, it would be on the riverbank, I would think.
While we're sort of within the home, do we know anything about what role family played within the lives of ancient Egyptians?
Yeah, I mean, as is almost universal, family life is very important, and Egyptian governance kind of follows this face-to-face family model, the household model. So from examples that have been excavated, houses for the non-elite were not huge, so you'd be living cheek by jowl with your family. So you'd sometimes get on with them perhaps, and sometimes there would be disagreements. There is evidence of spaces designated for things like ancestor worship. That's important. So members of the family who are no longer there, the dead, are important. There are spaces we can infer for childbirth, because that's a very special part of life, and it seems to take place at least in the New Kingdom, in Thebes, in the south of Egypt, at a workers' town called Deir el-Medina. That has to do with the roof, and it has to do with temporary structures covered in leaves and kind of a shady area where you might want to hang out if you were heavily pregnant. But details like, childbirth, we do know stuff about that because there are illustrations in elite sources. And women, it is said, would squat on bricks to give birth. And the bricks would be decorated potentially with protective gods, because childbirth was potentially very dangerous. So you'd want all the protection of household gods. So that does argue that, childbirth, child rearing was very important and needed to invoke the presence of superhuman beings, gods like Bes, who's a little dwarf with feathers in his hair, who holds knives to scare off the demons that are lurking at the edge of our world, or Taweret, who's shown as a pregnant hippopotamus, who would come and scare off dangerous beings. These things all argue for ancient Egyptians wanting to safeguard the childbearing and child-rearing process.
And we're going to definitely come on to the experience of children at this time. But talking about childbirth, what do we know about the role, responsibilities, and I guess rights of women in ancient Egypt?
We know some things, again, mainly from elite contexts, where there are documents. So if you have a document that concerns property transfer, so that's something you would want to write down. One example springs to mind, the will of a lady called Naunacht from Thebes, again, New Kingdom, Thebes, 1200s, say, BCE, now in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, talks about, she falls out with some of her family and she wants to disinherit people. But the interesting thing is, she as a woman has the say over what happens to the property. So it does seem, based on the information we have, which is written and fairly elite, that some women in ancient Egyptian society were in a better legal position than their contemporaries in other cultures. The day-to-day experience I already alluded to, there are illustrations of market scenes. So in this, it seems largely to be as many women as men are involved in buying and selling. And from maybe more recent contexts where that kind of commerce seems gendered, the ancient Egyptian evidence does not obey or does not follow our expectation. Another fun fact, again from Deir el-Medina, workers' town, 1200s BC, laundry is done professionally by men, not by women. So again, something we might think of as gendered in a certain way, it's a different case in ancient Egypt.
What do we know about their idea of, I guess, what we would call modern romantic relationships? Did they have an equivalent?
Yes, there's love poetry. Absolutely. Great insight into, people falling in love and trying to get the attention of a partner, using magic potentially to get hold of that person you actually really quite fancy. Marriage itself, though, is not as formal as we might think in parts of the modern world. It's not exchanging rings or having a ceremony even. The written evidence we have, again, from areas where we can shine a light, like Deir el-Medina, the workers' town, 1200 BC, that talks about carrying the bundle. So you take your stuff and you move into your partner's house. That is it. That is marriage. And people appear as couples in scenes, almost exclusively men and women. But we do know there were same-sex situations, if not lifestyles, as we might understand them today, there would be same-sex desire is attested. The heteronormative expectation does appear in scenes. It does appear with the man and the wife and the children. But actual weddings, a party maybe, you might have a party, but it wasn't as formalised as a modern marriage, no.
I think there's also a perception surrounding ancient Egyptian relationships that a lot of them were polygamous. How true is this perception?
This is something, a persistent misconception based on, again, the elite evidence, which relates often to the king. For religious reasons, and it is attested in other cultures and other times, the royal family would want to keep power, and we're talking about power and influence and the ability to make decisions within a small group, because you don't want to let your property go outside the controlling group. So for those reasons, you may choose to marry within the group. There is no question that the pharaoh had multiple wives. The male pharaoh had multiple wives at the same time. I mean, these were not consecutive. They were contiguous. They were happening at the same time. And you do wonder, given the importance of the female bloodline, whether they just really the kings wanted to produce as many children as possible, just to ensure the succession was an absolutely done deal. That does not apply necessarily to non-royal people. Marriage, family, then as now, is expensive. So I think the general understanding is, for where we have evidence of documents of the non-royals, people only tended to have one partner. And if the partner dies, you can remarry, and there are social arrangements for that. But it was not that all ancient Egyptians were polygamous. That really was something focused on the royal family.
What about children? What was the status of children at this time?
Children were not as much probably as of a special category as they are today. Childhood was not as extended as it is today. I think as soon as you could, you'd help out your parents. And the main means of education was apprenticeship. There is no real concept of the school. Schools, where you have a teacher instructing pupils, is an anachronism. Unless you were that small scribal elite, in which case you would have maybe one-to-one tuition. And we have evidence of written exercises where someone, probably a young scribe, has not been very confident with their hieroglyphic hand and they've had it corrected. That's quite nice. This is quite uncommon. Most people would follow, and by people, I guess, in a professional sense, I mainly mean boys, would follow what their father did. For girls and for women, there is rather limited evidence for what was going on. There is one term, very common term, in the written sources for women, the nebet pair, which means something like, rather reductively, it's called housewife in English sometimes, but it means mistress of the house. So she would be in charge of household affairs, and that's kind of shoving women into the domestic context. But as I've said, trade, commerce, the marketeering, going to market, was seen as an extension of the household, and women were doing that. So it's not simply her indoors. There's a broader experience, I think, of society for women.
Speaking about the experiences of children as well as of education, what did they do for fun? Were there particular hobbies and pastimes that we know about?
We have images that seem to show people having a good time. We have images of games, things pretty, bit of rough and tumble, things like look like leapfrog or some kind of physical games with balls and throwing, and whether there's a religious context to that, We're not sure, because why those activities would be depicted on tomb chapel walls. Remember, none of that decoration is simply, well, it's not decoration. It's not just to make a wall look pretty. It's got a deeply serious religious import. So we do, though, have physical evidence from one particular town, the town of Kahun, a Middle Kingdom town, maybe around 1800, 1700 BCE. We have a number of these items in Manchester Museum, where I work, and they give an insight into household life. So there are objects from houses, there are tools, there are things that you might have around the house, including, a slingshot, where you could go out to the local, the marshy area near the Fayum Lake and go and hunt for some birds. There are definitely stuffed leather balls, which have no other explanation other than, you were just playing some kind of ball game. Actually defining, though, toys is difficult, because what is a toy? The definition of a toy is how it's used. There are some things which may look like toys, which may have been quite serious religious objects. There are things which may look quite serious that actually may have just been given to kids to play with. But, as I say, the kind of socialization of children, I think, happened much earlier. So there wouldn't be special stories for kids. The kids would just listen to whatever the adult stories were, and they would become part of the adult world sooner than we'd expect in most of the modern world.
Let's take a pause here, a little sidestep. Now, as you know, we've asked you every episode to bring in an object or an artefact that can really highlight something about ancient Egyptian life. Now, today's object, I believe, very much links to hobbies and pastimes. So what is our artefact for today?
So this is an example of something that seems to have been quite common across the social spectrum, which is nice to say. It is a board game. Well, it's got a board. It may not be quite what we think of a board game called Senet. So Senet is a board with a series of squares along which you would move game pieces. So you could play it with two people, and the term Senet means plausibly something like passing or going past. So the exact rules are not entirely understood, but there are some of those squares that are marked with particularly positive or negative associations. So you could imagine if your game piece landed on a certain one, you might have to go back, or you could go forward a certain number of squares. The great thing about Senet is we have physical examples attested in the tomb of Tutankhamun. So the pharaoh was playing this game. Equally, we have illustrations of the Queen of Egypt, the wife of Ramesses II, a lady called Nefertari. She's shown in her tomb, sat at one of these boards, placing her counter on the Senet board, but she's not playing it with anyone. And maybe there's an added sense of she's using it as a way to get into the afterlife. So it could have some other serious implication. But there are examples of these boards, very distinctive sets of squares, which can mean nothing else, I'm sure, carved on the floors of tomb chapels within the area where the light comes in the doorway. So these presumably were very ad hoc means of playing Senet that could be played by anyone. So the regular people played them, and the pharaoh played Senet.
I should say thank you to Barbara Brown on Facebook, who's one of our listeners, for bringing up the toys and games side of this time.
Thanks, Barbara.
But unfortunately, we are going back to the average work week. We're going to look at jobs and livelihoods. What did the day-to-day life look like? What was the average work week?
Well, the ancient Egyptian week was differently organised to our work week. And again, we have to fall back on written sources, the very few we have, given it's 3,000 years and such a big country. So, Deir el-Medina, workers' town, we have documentary evidence of a 10-day week. So the month is 30 days, divided into these 3-day weeks. And the weekend seems to be 2 days, but there are regular holidays. So we know the work gang who were excavating, decorating, stocking, provisioning the Pharaoh's tomb down in Thebes would always have their attendance taken in a register by the more senior scribes so that they could keep tabs on the state-funded project. And we have a great set of texts that talk about the reasons for absence. So you could say you didn't go to work because you were brewing beer, or you were mummifying your mother, or you were drinking with the gods. So the acceptability, you could also be sick, as you would expect from more modern experience. So the working week, was differently organised. It was longer than we think of as the standard 7-day week. But I think, that time was punctuated with partying, recovering from the partying, doing your work, and having a good time. People almost universally want to have a good time to alleviate the boredom of life. But we do get an insight at Deir el-Medina where the work itself was monitored. So, the daily grind of showing up at a certain place, you'd have your tools weighed in and out each day. So the tools for the excavating the tombs were made of copper alloy or bronze. And the state that was organising the excavation of the tomb would try and ensure that you weren't removing some of the copper alloy. So you might hear that excuse on the railways today for delays. The people have been stealing the copper wires. It was happening in ancient times. Occasionally they would reforge the tools. They'd collect them and reforge them. And there was a lot of side hustles. We've got evidence of side hustles. So you have your day job and you get paid for that in kind, in food and provisions and sacks of wheat to make bread. But you could barter that if you had extra. And then you might, if you were a skilled carpenter, you might make a coffin or a statue for someone, and they'd pay you separately. So there was quite a keen household industry going on at this town of Deir el-Medina.
Now, what were the most common occupations and trades? If I were to go to the ancient Egyptian job centre, what would be my opportunities?
I think, majority of people are doing farming, something that relates to farming. Then there are people who would have specialist skills that, a builder, someone who's going to build your house. I don't know, maybe that wasn't a particular profession that most people made do with their own level of skills which were passed down. So maybe building or extending a house, mummifying someone, treatment of the dead, unless you were talking about the elite, was not maybe a specialist skill. So people were doing that themselves. So we know for the workers of Deir el-Medina, the day job was excavating, decorating tombs, and maybe you had a side hustle using your regular skills, but then you were also, on top of that, part-time, doing priestly things. So this, I would say to you, is probably the most lucrative job you could get into for a regular-ish person, was to serve in a temple, because it meant pretty nice working conditions. Temples are cool, shaded, quiet, spacious. You got to take home the food that was offered to the gods, because the gods themselves are not coming to life and eating the food. And there was prestige. You might get training, or you might get some kind of initiation, which might involve literacy. And so you would do that. Most of the ancient Egyptian priesthood was part-time. So you would do another job, probably fairly well-off, well-paid job. Not farmers in the fields. I don't think farmers in the fields were allowed to be priests. But other people, builders, craftsmen, sculptors, might have this added string to their bow. And that would be, if I went to an ancient Egyptian job centre, I would choose to be a priest.
Sounds like a good choice, really. Yeah. If we say, though, that our average, ordinary ancient Egyptian was a farmer, I suppose we should probably talk about the agriculture and trade side of this time. Mm-hmm. What were the main agricultural products they would either be farming, or what livestock would they have?
That's a really, really important thing to emphasise, because if you go into a supermarket today, you might see cucumbers from Egypt, or you'd get Egyptian cotton bedding, bed linen. But there was no cotton in ancient times that we're really aware of. The majority fabric would be linen. So they're definitely growing flax for linen. They're growing emmer and barley wheat to make bread, which is absolutely the staple. Also, it makes beer and bread were the main feature of the Egyptian diet. Not a lot of meat was consumed by a normal ancient Egyptian. A wealthy ancient Egyptian maybe was having a side of beef for dinner every night, and you can tell because their arteries are clogged where the mummified bodies are preserved. But cattle, very important, very central to any kind of wealth creation. So one of the most important administrative roles was to be an overseer of cattle. If you were in charge of cattle, you were someone important. But I think most farmers are growing, emmer, barley, wheat to provision themselves, and then there would be a surplus that was gathered in tax. So the ancient Egyptians were very big sticklers on paying tax. There are a few things certain in life. Death and taxes definitely applied in ancient Egypt. So other things on the side, I have the impression that most ancient Egyptian households were self-sufficient. You grew the food you need, vegetables, the provisions for bread and beer. Occasionally, there'd be a party, there would be a religious festival. Someone in the town, in the village, would kill a cow, and then everyone would have meat as part of that, although it wasn't terribly common. And that was the experience for most. If you work at a town like Deir el-Medina, which is in the desert, it's next to the Valley of the Kings, you immediately remove people from the ability to farm. So you're paying them not to do farming, but to do building tombs. And that is where we see a fascinating supply chain where they're provisioning this weird artificial settlement of 50-odd people in the middle of the desert. So they're sending water, they're sending grain, they're sending just things for daily life. And if those things stop, as we know happened, because the central administration runs out of funds, the people put down their tools and they go on strike. So although there is so much more we would want to know about the realities of life, there are these little bits of light very occasionally where you really get a vivid sense of what life might have been like.
They're really fascinating insights. I was going to ask you where could they go and pick up their groceries, but I guess that supply chain, that's kind of it for people who aren't living next to the Nile.
Yes, exactly.
Well, speaking of the Nile, we should definitely talk about its significance here. How influential was it when it came to this side of life?
I think it's influential in the sense of it creates life. The Greek historian Herodotus says Egypt is the gift of the Nile, and without it, Egypt would be pretty barren. There'd be a few oases, perhaps, but not very attractive for human habitation on any great scale. So the river is the main thoroughfare, it's the main transport, it's the main highway. It's producing water, other than water taken from wells. We know of that as well. But it allows fishing. It allows fowling, where you go and you hunt birds, which can add to the diet. It, as I said, breaks its banks every year and floods and deposits these very rich soils on the riverbanks. So it allows farming and agriculture. And then it becomes a metaphor for the afterlife and for death. So going into the afterlife is viewed as a riverine journey. Various gods are associated with the water and the marshes. So the river itself is viewed as happy. Happy is the name, not as happy the emotion, but happy the emotion as well, I guess. So it's personified as this life-giving divinity. And actually the word for the Nile in ancient Egyptian was Iteru, which means the river. Because the ancient Egyptians, most of them didn't know any other river, unless they'd been on campaign and, gone to see the Euphrates. So the Nile is fundamental to life in ancient Egypt.
Definitely a really important point that we are going to probably be emphasising in every episode here. Now, to pivot slightly, how did they manage healthcare and medicine? Was it a bit rough, or were they quite advanced?
I mean, it's easy to make judgments from the point of view of a modern perspective. So in the pre-modern world, how are you negotiating, navigating health issues? And actually, the ancient Egyptians are famous even amongst the Greeks and the Romans already as healers, as practitioners of healing. They have quite a good reputation as being quite informed. I don't want to say advanced, but they have this reputation for knowledge. And we have even surviving the texts of manuals to deal with head injuries, to deal with gynecological issues, to deal with veterinary issues even. So they're even considering animals. So these medical texts are, what do you do if a patient presents themselves with? So you tend to have, three options. You can either treat it, or maybe you can treat it, or it's hopeless. It's a hopeless case. So what we would define as medicine very much goes hand in hand with what we would now define as magic. But there's not a distinction. There are just ways of dealing with affliction. But there are practical things which are recognised today. So you break a bone, you can bandage the broken bone with a splint to help it fuse back together. And it's a practice that's still used today. And it's interesting actually to extrapolate that to consider mummification. What is mummification actually all about? Mummification is about transforming, healing the body back to life. So the analogy, I think, probably wasn't lost on the ancient Egyptians. There are texts that talk about prescriptions, basically, what herbs or treatments should be given. So there are things, described as, crocodile dung should be used for. And whether they're actually describing crocodile dung or whether crocodile dung is a word to describe something else, it's just a colloquial or magical word to describe something else, is not entirely clear. But, the antibacterial properties of honey are known and used. Certain herbs, certain spices, certain treatments are known about and are a practical, effective way of dealing with ailments.
I mean, crocodile dung is quite something. What have been some of the most weird and wonderful cures or remedies that you've seen?
Crocodile dung is probably my favourite. But then they're very fond of a fumigation. So you would burn incense and you would have to squat over the burning incense and hope the incense would drive away whatever ailed you. So there are there are certain terms like being the shepherd of the royal anus is a way of describing someone very high status who was in attendance on the king, presumably, who might be involved in some kind of digestive affairs. But it's funny. I mean, I think the ancient Egyptians had some practical knowledge, perhaps because of the mummification process and knowing about the workings of the anatomy, which maybe other cultures simply didn't deal with because death was a particular taboo, and treating or dealing with or intervention into the corpse was a taboo, which for the ancient Egyptians it wasn't. So I think some understanding about human anatomy does seem to have derived from embalming. But, texts which talk about doing a certain incantation alongside something we would recognise as something more practical today seems to have been passed down in time and have been considered an effective remedy.
After talking about the shepherd of the royal anus, I'm really not quite sure where to go from there. So I think this is the perfect point to ask you. As you know, as well as an object and artefact, we're going to talk about a person that you have nominated for us for this episode. So who are we meeting today?
So today we're meeting someone, we don't know their name, but they are a type of person who I think would have been very important in a village context in ancient Egypt. And at Manchester Museum, we have some of their toolkit. So as part of the toolkit, there is a figurine, a small wooden figurine, maybe less than 30 centimetres in height, showing a naked female figure with the face of a god. And it seems that this healer, or you might say magician, has power over nature. So this is indicated by the fact the figurine is holding snakes in her hands. And actually, from a similar site of around the same time, around about 1800 BC, we have an example from the town of Kahun I mentioned before, another workers, pyramid builders town from around that period, serving in what we call the Middle Kingdom. We have a mask. It's not a mummy mask. It wasn't placed on a dead body. It was used by a living performer to take on the identity of the god and to chase away dangerous beings. And the thing I really appreciate about this performer is they can be either male or female, and they need to have knowledge. So they would be presumably someone who could read out the spells that I mentioned before, these medical treatises, these texts that talk about how you would deal with a certain ailment. But they would also use objects like hippo tusks. So this is a very typical pharaonic attitude. You take something dangerous and you turn it into something protective. So a hippo is a dangerous animal. It still is responsible for more deaths in Africa than any other creature, I think. But if you manage to get hold of a hippo tusk and you could shape it into a wand, if you like, and carve images of protective gods on, you could encircle someone, you could use it practically as some obstetricians, gynecologists pointed out to me once, you could use it to help deliver a baby. And you could use it as a placebo. So it's the placebo effect I think is important to convince your patient that you are a version of the god, you are temporarily channeling the power of the gods, what the ancient Egyptians called Heka power, the power to deal with adversity. And so my choice of person is the owner of this toolkit that we have some of now in Manchester, who used those objects to help people in their care.
It's lovely to meet somebody, the ordinary person here, really. Now, having met our healer, what would you say our chances of survival are?
Better than doing nothing. I think better than doing nothing. I mean, it's difficult to compare with other cultures. So, because the Greeks and the Romans say the ancient Egyptians are great at medicine, then we kind of back project this to be true. So we think the ancient Egyptians must be really, really good. They dealt with adversity. They were clever lateral thinking people. I think your chances in the hands of a healer, whether through psychological support or practical intervention would be better than in other cultures.
As a final question to you, if we were to go back in time, how do you think we would have fared in general, not just with the medicine? Would we have coped living in this ancient society?
I think human beings in general are very adaptable. So, if you were parachuted into the town of Deir el-Medina, and you could you could turn your hand to chiseling the limestone of the Valley of the Kings, you probably would be okay. Conditions, for hard work were not great, but there would be weekends, there would be festivals, there would be access to these healers. Sometimes at Deir el-Medina, they're specified as female. There's a lady called the Wise Woman. So as long as you had access to those kind of people, I think you would fare okay. We'd survive.
Bit of a relief there. I'm glad. Thank you, Campbell. Thanks for joining me on this episode.
Quite all right.
And that brings us to the end of this episode. Be sure to join us again next time when we'll be looking at the art and architecture and fashion and festivals of ancient Egypt.